So a lot of you guys ask me, hey, how can I, do this query on this field for this value that has single and double quotes in it, and I keep getting errors because my query gets screwed up, or I get a syntax error or whatever, and that is related to your single and double quotes, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm your host, Sean MacKenzie. Thank you for joining me once again on my channel on data engineering. In this episode, we go back to our Microsoft Access playlist, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to structure our queries so that we can include things like double quotes and single quotes, because we need to use those things in order to make our query around, say, a text field or something like that. And there's a couple little techniques that you can use. There's various ways that you can do it, and I'm going to present some of my favorite ways today. Hey guys, make sure to check out my Patreon. My Discord is now connected, and I will be having drop-in sessions once per week. Okay, so this is a pretty fun one today, guys. We are using this little database that I got here, and I will make this available on my downloads page when I'm done here. And what we've got is we've got a single table that we've used before. I've imported it from the other database. You can see it has last name, first name, position, certification level, region, and sector. And I've got a last name with an apostrophe in it, and I've got a sector with a double quote and a single quote, and 3 double quotes and 3 single quotes. And so we have some fields there with some kind of unique values, and they're not immediately, it's not immediately obvious how to query for those values. And so that's what we're going to do today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the create ribbon there, and I'll create a query in query design, and I'll just close that little pop-up that comes up there, and I'm going to just drag the staff table onto the query area there, and you can see we've got our query here, and you can see it's got selected here the star, which means all of the values. And so we'll grab all of the values, that means all of the columns in the table, and then until we put a criteria in the criteria row there in the grid view, we will get all of the rows. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to look for all of the rows with O'Connor in the last name, and O'Connor has a single quote in it, and you can see it's quite simple for us to create a criteria with O'Connor in it, because we can just put a double quote around the value that has a single quote in it, and that gives us the rows with O'Connor in it, and that's exactly what we want to see there. And so that's nice and simple. You can see our query worked just fine, but what if we had a double quote in our field? And so we could try that as well, and we could see if we can query for that scenario. And so I'll choose our sector field here, and what I'll do first is I'll just put in what we would try to put in if we, kind of were just trying this for the first time. And so I'm going to get the value. It's a double quote delta single quote 5. So we'll put that in as if we were going to query for that, and you can see the error that we will get. So I'll put in a double quote, and then a, and then double quote, delta single quote 5, and then a double quote. And when I query for that, you can see that it returns invalid syntax, and that's because we've got a double quote in there in the middle of it, so that's screwing things up, and it's making it so our query, the engine doesn't know how to handle that. And so one way that you can simply do it is by changing those outside double quotes into single quotes, which is actually the more native database-y way of doing it, and then leaving your double quotes the way that they are inside of your string, but then escaping the single quotes, which means making each of those double. And so you can see that we were able to do that query by doing that. So we have another value here that we could query for. It has 3 double quotes and 3 single quotes in it. And so you could use the same technique here. And so we've got a single quote around the outside. You've got a double quotes. You have 3 of those in a row. And then I've got Charlie, and then 3 single quotes, and then a 6 after it. And so if I actually expand that out, I can have 6 single quotes in a row to see if that works. And there you go. There's our value. And so each of those single quotes was escaped, we call it. And so that means that the single quote was put into the query, and the database engine was able to use that value, and that is exactly what we want to see there. So keep in mind that there are 2 ways to make queries in the query design and other parts of the database like code. One is by using a single quote around the outside of the query, and one is by using a double quote around the outside of the query. And so it may depend on the kind of data that you have inside of your query, how you use your search terms and things like that. And so I'll just clear that query for now. We're going to come back to that later, and I'll save that. And we're going to go take a look at some code now, and we want to see how can we implement the same idea if we are using our VBA code, because it's very likely that if you're running a procedure and you have to loop through some records and look something up for each one, that's quite detailed or complex, and so you may have to use some code. And so you'll see that I went to the create ribbon there and I created a new module, and then I'm just going to save it. I called it MOD quote, and we're going to create a little sub routine here. And we're going to use some of our VBA to create a new DLOOKUP, and we're going to use it in sort of a way that you might use when you're doing some programming. And so I'll put a little comment at the top here. I'll say prints out the query result, and we're actually going to use a DLOOKUP for this. We'll use a couple of variables. I'm just going to create a name variable and a where variable, and each of those will hold a string, and then I'll create a return variable which is called var_ret_val, and that is just going to be the default data type, which is a variant, and that will either be null if it gets nothing, or it'll have a value in it. And so for the simple example, we can load up our name here, and we'll say the name is equal to O'Connor, and we'll put our where clause in there, and we'll say last name equals, and then a single quote, kind of like what we were talking about before, where single quotes can be very, very flexible because it can allow you to put other kinds of things into your string. And so we're going to use that with a replace, and we'll say the name variable, and then we'll replace single quotes with 2 single quotes, not a double quote, and then we'll end our string with a single quote. And so what that does is if there's any single quotes inside of the string, like the apostrophe in O'Connor that you see there, if there are any of those single quotes, it's going to change those into double quotes. So if there's 2, it'll make, if there's 2 single quotes, it'll make 4. If there's, 3, it'll make 6. And those will be all escaped, is what we call it. And so they will actually go into the query properly, and that's what we want to see. So there's our where clause, and we're going to use that as the last part of our DLOOKUP, where we're looking in, we're looking for the sector field in the staff table according to the where clause that we created, and we'll debug.print the return value there, and you can see when I hit the play button on the toolbar, you can see that it returned Bravo. And we can also type in the name of the query and just hit enter. We can type in quote query and hit enter, and that's the same as hitting play on the toolbar there. And so as you can see, that worked very well for having our name, looking for single quotes in names. Usually if it's a name field, it will not have a double quote in it, and so you could get away with using some query that uses this kind of syntax, and it will solve all of your issues to do with the single quotes. Now, if you have something or a field that has double quotes in it, then there are a couple of ways that you can do it. And the first way that I'll show you is to look for your value using the double quote in there natively. And so to build that string, if you were to look for that, you would actually there's many ways you can do it. You can do double quotes. Some people do it that way. I like to be very specific. And so the way that I can do that is by using the character 34, concatenating a string with character 34, which specifically says put a double quote here in this string. And so you can see I've created the sector variable there, and it is a double quote delta apostrophe 5. And so now we can say str where sector equals, and then we can put in, instead of the name variable, we'll put in the sector variable, and using the same technique with the single quotes, using the replace, and we will look for the last name in the staff table where the sector is equal to that. And if I run it by putting my cursor next to the name there in the immediate window, you can see it returns Williams, which is exactly what we want to see there. That's great. And so what we did there was we took that A, we put a double quote after it, and then the rest of the string that we want to look for. And so that worked great. And you know, what if we had something a little more complex that we're looking for, like that second lookup with all of the double quotes in it? Well, that would be kind of similar to what we have here. And you could use the double quote method where you can use double quotes, but as I mentioned, I like to put in my character 34s so that it's very specific, and then we can have our 3 single quotes, which is the actual value in the field. So that is our sector. It's a B with the 3 double quotes and 3 single quotes. And so if I delete that result and go back and rerun it, you can see now I get Barker, which is the right value for that sector. And so you can see that when you get into using it in VBA, that you have a little more option. There's a bit more option to use things. You can also use character 34 in your grid view in your query, but nice thing that you can do here is to use the replace function to replace those single quotes with 2 single quotes that escapes it. It helps to escape it so that you get the right value. Now, the next thing that I want to show you is how to use a parameter instead of, you know, a concatenated value or some modified value to do your query. Now you can see we are returning all of the fields there with the staff.star, and I'm going to go and I'm going to create a form using form design. So I'll just create a blank form here. It's not bound to anything, meaning it doesn't have a record set under it. This is just a user form that's out there somewhere, that's open, that has some value on it. And in this case, it's going to have a sector value on the form. Now, forms are great because you can have things like text boxes and things like that on them, so that you can type into those things, and you can be very specific, and they aren't they're not really bound by any kind of anything, the way that the query grid is. And so you can have, a text box with War and Peace in it if you want, and it'll hold that value, or you can just have, last name, first name, or whatever. And so here we go. I created this very simple form. I created one text box on the form, and I saved it, and I called it FRM sector. And I'm going to put in our query value the B, double quote, double quote, double quote, Charlie, single quote, single quote, single quote, 6. Say that very quickly. And now I can go back to my query, because that form is open and it's active, and so that means that you can use what's called an expression as a parameter in your query. And so we can say forms, form sector, txt sector with exclamation marks between each of those, and that's going to go look for that value and put it in as a criteria into our query. And so if I run that query, you can see it comes up beautifully without having to do any kind of funky magic at all on those strings. So parameters are really awesome that way, especially if you have, like I said, anything that is staff facing or customer facing. It's a little more secure, but in a lot of cases parameters are actually way more easy to use too. Once things get a little bit complex, you want to make sure that you can use those parameters. And so if I go back to our VBA code here, as you can see, I can put in the same expression that I put into the query grid. I can use that same expression in my DLOOKUP in VBA, and so you can see that it translates across very nicely. And so now I don't have any of that stuff that we used before, so I'll comment out these other variables here being loaded just to show that we're not using those. Now I've just got my parameter in there, and I'm gonna put my cursor beside the subroutine name in the immediate window and hit enter, and then you can see it gets the value that I want. And so you can use parameters for lots of different things, and they are super handy and a great alternative. Gives you lots of options for your complex queries. And so you might be wondering, what if I want to use this form value that you see here, but I want to do an insert statement that inserts into that table. And so we can do that by creating a new procedure in which we will use an SQL statement and our expression, which we're going to use as a parameter. We're going to insert a new row into our staff table. And so in order to do that, I'll create a SQL string variable, and we'll load that strSQL with an insert statement, and we'll say, insert into staff. I guess I won't use all of the fields. I can't remember all of the names, but I'll insert last name, first name, and sector, and that will create a new row in that table that you saw. And so we'll extend this onto the next line here, and so we'll insert values, and I'll just hard code some values for the first two. You could use parameters for these as well, last name and first name, but for today's example I'll just say Hamilton for the last name and Wallace for the first name. And then for the third value, the sector with all the crazy characters in it, we're going to use that parameter form sector and then txt sector that we have open in our form, and that's going to automatically use that parameter and go get it. That's a really great thing that is part of Access SQL, that you can use these expressions. It's very, very powerful,
And now I can put my cursor in here and I can either just press play or I can type in the function. I'll press play here and you can see it says you're about to append one row, and you can say yes, and then we can go and look at our table and we'll be able to see a new row with that value that you see there. So we want to take a look at that. So I'm going to close our query and I'll just open the table here and just make sure that that value is there. And there you go, the most recent value is Wallace Hamilton. We missed a couple of fields, but there is our crazy sector value, and that is exactly what we want to see, and that is how you can do an insert using a parameterized value, which is nice and efficient and effective. And that is how you can handle your single and double quotes in your queries in Microsoft Access.
Looking for the files used in these videos? Make sure to check out my download page. The link is in the description.